On the afternoon of the 17th of March, 1842, 20 women climbed a narrow staircase over a store on Water Street in Nauvoo, Illinois, and one of them opened a blank book and began to write. Her name was Eliza Snow, and the book she filled that day recorded a woman being elected president, a treasury being opened, a constitution being adopted, and a man handing that room something he called a key. That book then went into a church archive, and the complete text of it did not become publicly available to ordinary members until 2016, 174 years. So tonight, I want to hand you 12 things about the women of this church that most Latter-day Saints were never taught, and every one of them is documented, dated, and named. There are two easy versions of this story, and both are wrong. The grievance version, where everything was stolen. The comfortable version, where nothing ever changed. What actually happened is stranger. These women had authority, money, a printing press, the vote, hospitals, and a seat in a state senate. And over about a century, most of it quietly went somewhere else, for reasons that made sense to the people deciding. Nobody sat down and erased them. So what I'm after tonight isn't a villain in a room. It's the quiet kind of forgetting, where nothing is destroyed and nobody lies. And 2 generations later, a young woman assumes the women in her church's past stood in the background. They did not, and you know what you get from me. The question taken seriously, everybody in it treated fairly, and my faith kept without the noise. One quick thing before we start counting. This channel is only just getting going, and it's here to put the real version of this history in front of people who were handed the short version. A like and a subscribe are what let something this small keep running. And tell me where you're watching from tonight, because on this one especially I want to know who's out there. Stay through number 9, because that's where the women of this church get the vote, 50 years before the rest of American women do, and then lose it to an act of Congress, and then take it back. Number 3 is where 6,000 of them fill a building to tell Washington what they think, and the newspapers back east can't process what they're hearing. And number 1 is the woman whose name almost nobody knows. Let's count down. Number 12. The Relief Society did not start as a church auxiliary. It started as their own organization with their own money. It began with sewing. In early 1842, a woman named Sarah Kimball and her seamstress, Margaret Cook, decided to form a society to make shirts for the men working on the Nauvoo temple. Ordinary charity, the kind of thing women's groups all over America were doing. They asked Eliza Snow to write them a constitution, and Eliza did. And when it was shown to Joseph Smith, he said the Constitution was the best that could be made, but that he had something better for them, and that he would organize the women under the priesthood, after the pattern of the priesthood. So on the 17th of March, they met in that upper room. And what they organized was not a sewing circle. They elected Emma Smith president, and she chose Sarah Cleveland and Elizabeth Ann Whitney as counselors. They named themselves. They voted on their own members. They set dues and kept a treasury and dispersed relief on their own decision. And Joseph according to the minutes Eliza was keeping right there in the room, told them, "I now turn the key to you in the name of God, and this society shall rejoice, and knowledge and intelligence shall flow down from this time. And I'll be straight with you, because that line has a history." A later published version rendered it as turning the key in your behalf, and historians have argued about the difference for years, and the difference matters a great deal to how much authority you think just got handed over. The minute book says to you. That's what the woman with the pen wrote down as it was being said. Inside a few months, that society had grown past 1,300 women. Not a committee, the largest organized body in the city, run by women, funded by women, that decided for itself who got helped. Number 11. For about 100 years, the women of this church anointed and blessed the sick with approval. And it wasn't rare. This is the one that stops people cold, and it is not a fringe claim from a critic. It is documented in the Relief Society's own minutes, in dozens of women's diaries, and in the church's own historical volume on the subject. Latter-day Saint women washed and anointed other women and prayed over them for healing, most commonly before childbirth. And they did it for generations. Bathsheba Smith did it. Zina Young did it constantly and wrote about it. And Patty Bartlett Sessions, a midwife who came west with the pioneers and kept a diary for decades, recorded delivering close to 4,000 babies over her working life. And the blessing was simply part of how she worked. Eliza Snow defended the practice in print when people questioned it, arguing that a woman didn't need to hold an office to exercise a gift of faith. And it narrowed slowly over the first half of the 20th century as blessings were centralized and standardized, until it was ended by a letter. On the 29th of July, 1946, Joseph Fielding Smith wrote to Belle Spafford, then the General President of the Relief Society, saying that while it was permissible under certain conditions for sisters to wash and anoint other sisters, it was far better to send for the elders. That was the end of it. And today, healing blessings in this church are given by men holding the priesthood. Now, I'm going to do something here that this channel does, and give you the case for the change rather than just the loss. Standardizing ordinances is what a global church does when it stops being 100,000 people in a valley and starts being millions of people on every continent. And consistency is a real value, not a cover story. That's the honest reason. But you can hold that and also notice that a woman in 1880 knew something about her own religious life that a woman in 1960 did not, and nobody ever announced the difference to her. Nothing was hidden. It just stopped. And then it stopped being mentioned, and then it was gone. Number 10. They ran their own newspaper for 42 years. On the 1st of June, 1872, in Salt Lake City, the first issue of a paper called The Woman's Exponent came off the press. Its first editor was Louisa Lula Green, who was 23 years old. 5 years later, Emmeline Wells took it over and ran it until 1914. And look at what they printed on the masthead. The rights of the women of Zion, and the rights of the women of all nations. Not the rights of the women of Zion, all nations. These were women in a desert territory 1,000 miles from anywhere, and the paper they founded put itself in the same sentence as the International Women's Movement, on purpose, in 1872. Here's the part that matters most and gets missed. The Exponent was not an official church publication. It was independent, and it survived on subscriptions the women collected themselves. Which means that for 42 years, the women of this church had something almost no religious women in America had: an unfiltered printing press and the money to keep it running. They ran suffrage arguments in it, and obituaries, and poetry, and theology, and open disagreements with each other. Number 9. And this is the one I'd put money on you not knowing the full shape of. Latter-day Saint women got the vote in 1870, 50 years early, and then Congress took it away from them. On the 12th of February, 1870, the territorial legislature of Utah passed a bill giving women the vote, and the acting governor, a man named S.A. Mann, signed it. 2 days later, on the 14th of February, a 23-year-old schoolteacher named Seraph Young walked into a municipal election in Salt Lake City and cast a ballot, which makes her the first woman to vote under an equal suffrage law in the United States of America. Wyoming had passed its law 2 months earlier. Utah held an election first, so the first woman to actually vote under a suffrage law in this country was a Latter-day Saint schoolteacher on her way to work. And here is what almost nobody tells you. She lost it. In 1887, Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act, aimed at breaking the church's political and economic power over the territory, and one of its provisions specifically stripped the vote from the women of Utah. Read that again. The federal government took the vote away from a group of American women who already had it, by name, and did it as a punishment aimed at their church. They spent 9 years getting it back, and when Utah wrote its state constitution to enter the Union, the women fought to have suffrage written into the document itself, rather than left to a later legislature. And they won, and it went into effect with statehood in 1896. So mark that. The women of this church are, as far as I can find, the only group of American women who won the vote, had it taken from them by an act of Congress, and then won it back a second time. Number 8. And while they were doing all that, they were not doing it alone in a desert. They were in the room with the most famous suffragists in America, and the relationship was complicated in both directions. In 1871, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to Salt Lake City and spent hours in a room full of Latter-day Saint women, which is not a sentence most members of this church have ever heard. In January of 1879, Emmeline Wells and Zena Young Williams traveled to Washington, addressed the National Suffrage Convention, and were received at the White House by President Rutherford Hayes and his wife. In 1889, the women of Utah organized their own suffrage association, affiliated with the national one, with Emmeline Wells at the head of it. In 1895, with the state constitution being written, Anthony herself came back to Salt Lake and spoke, and Latter-day Saint women filled the seats. Now the complicated part, in both directions, because I said I'd give you the real version. From the national side, plenty of suffragists wanted nothing to do with Utah. To much of the Eastern movement, plural marriage was exactly the sort of thing women's votes were supposed to abolish. And a delegation of Latter-day Saint women arriving at a convention was, to some of them, an embarrassment and a liability. That opposition was real, and it was often ugly. And from the Utah side, the alliance was genuinely strange too. These women were working alongside a movement whose leading figures thought their marriages were an abomination, and doing it because they had decided that the vote mattered more than the discomfort. Anthony and Stanton, for their part, took a position that took some nerve at the time. They argued that whatever they personally thought of plural marriage, disenfranchising a whole territory of women to punish their religion was still wrong. Emmeline Wells kept at that work for 50 years. She went to London as a delegate to the International Council of Women in 1899. She was still going in her 90s. And she is the same woman who was editing the Woman's Exponent from number 10 and organizing the wheat you'll hear about at number 4, which tells you something about how few people were actually carrying all of this. It wasn't a movement of thousands of leaders. It was a couple of dozen women doing 4 jobs each for 60 years. Number 7. And this one falls in the exact same year the vote came back, which is not a coincidence. One of them was elected the first woman state senator in American history, and she beat her own husband to do it. Her name was Martha Hughes Cannon, and by 1896, she had already lived 4 lives. She'd crossed the plains as a small child. She'd earned a medical degree from the University of Michigan in 1880. She was a practicing physician, a public health advocate, and a plural wife. In the autumn of 1896, in the first election held under the new state constitution, Utah's 5th senatorial district ran an at-large race with multiple seats. Martha ran as a Democrat. Her husband, Angus Cannon, ran as a Republican in the same race. She won, and he did not. And on the 3rd of November, 1896, she became the first woman ever elected to a state senate anywhere in the United States, and she used it. In the Senate, she wrote and pushed through public health legislation, including the bill that created Utah's State Board of Health and laws protecting the health of working women. In 2024, a statue of her was placed in the United States Capitol, which means the woman most Americans have never heard of now stands in the building where they took the vote away from her neighbors. Number 6. Because before she could be a senator, somebody had to send her to medical school. And this church did. In the 1870s, Brigham Young started calling from the pulpit for Latter-day Saint women to go east and train as physicians, and the reasoning was practical and characteristically blunt. The territory was isolated. Women were dying in childbirth, and the answer was to send women to get medical degrees and bring them home. So they went, alone, across the country, most of them with children. Romania Pratt Penrose graduated from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1877, having sold her own possessions to pay for part of it. Ellis Reynolds Shipp graduated from the same school in 1878, leaving small children behind in Utah to do it. Martha Hughes finished at Michigan in 1880, and when they came home, the Relief Society built them somewhere to work. The Deseret Hospital opened in Salt Lake City in 1882, with a governing board made up of women, several of whom you've already met tonight. Ellis Shipp then went and did the thing that multiplies. She opened a school of obstetrics and nursing and trained roughly 500 women who fanned out into settlements across the Mountain West as the only medical care for 100 miles in any direction. And remember Patty Sessions from number 11 and her 4,000 deliveries? That's the tradition Ella Ship was industrializing. Number 5. In 1898, 2 young women from Provo got on a boat, and the missionary program of this church has never looked the same since. For most of the 19th century, women went on missions the way women went most places, which is to say, attached to a husband. A man got called, his wife went with him. She did an enormous amount of the actual work, and the call had his name on it. That changed in the spring of 1898. The first presidency authorized calling single women as proselytizing missionaries in their own right, and the first 2 were Amanda Inez Knight and Lucy Jane Brimhall, both from Provo, both in their early 20s. They were set apart in April of 1898 and sent to the British mission, and they went out and knocked on doors in England as full missionaries, with their own names on their own calls. And the reasoning behind it was partly strategic, and I'm going to tell you that part too, rather than make it prettier than it was. Church leaders had noticed that women missionaries got in the door where men did not, and that they were unusually effective at answering exactly the thing the church needed answered in 1898, which was the picture the world had of Latter-day Saint women as silent and coerced. A confident, educated, funny 22-year-old woman standing in your parlor in Lancashire dismantles that picture faster than any pamphlet ever printed. So yes, it was partly public relations. It also permanently changed who gets to be a missionary in this church. Now watch the line run forward. In October of 2012, the church lowered the minimum age for women missionaries from 21 to 19, and the number of sister missionaries in the field roughly tripled inside about a year. Tens of thousands of them. Today, you cannot describe the missionary force of this church without them. And every one of those calls traces back to 2 women from Provo and a decision made in 1898. Number 4. They stored wheat for 40 years, and I'm going to tell you what happened to it, including the part that stings. In 1876, Brigham Young asked Emmeline Wells to organize the women of the church to store grain against famine, and they did it in the least glamorous way imaginable. They gleaned fields by hand after harvest. They held fundraisers. They built their own granaries. They bought wheat when it was cheap and sat on it, year after year, decade after decade, through droughts and depressions, and they did not eat it. By 1918, the Relief Society was holding more than 200,000 bushels of wheat, and the First World War was starving Europe. And that year, the wheat was sold to the United States government for the war effort, which is the version of this story you'll usually hear, and it's a good one. Now here's the rest of it. The sale was arranged by the First Presidency and the presiding bishopric, and the proceeds went into an account the Relief Society did not control. 42 years of gleaning, sold by other people, and the money placed elsewhere. The interest from it did fund Relief Society health work through the 1920s, maternity care and child welfare programs that saved real lives. So it isn't a story of theft, and I'm not going to sell it to you as one. But it's a clean picture of the whole century in one transaction. The work was theirs, the wheat was theirs, and the decision, at the moment it mattered most, was not. Number 3, 6,000 women in a tabernacle telling Congress it had them wrong. Now go back to 1870, 5 weeks before the vote. because this is where all of it comes from. In January of 1870, Congress was moving a bill called the Cullum Bill, an anti-polygamy measure that would have gutted the church's legal position in Utah. And part of the argument for it was that Latter-day Saint women were victims held in bondage who needed to be rescued by federal law. So on the 13th of January, 1870, they answered. Somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 Latter-day Saint women filled the old tabernacle in Salt Lake City for what got remembered as the Great Indignation Meeting. And they did not send a man to speak for them. Sarah Kimball spoke. The same Sarah Kimball whose sewing circle started number 12, 28 years earlier. Eliza Snow spoke. Bathsheba Smith from number 11 spoke. Phoebe Woodruff spoke. And what they said broke the frame the entire country had them in. They stood up and defended plural marriage as their own choice, and in the same speeches demanded political rights, and denied loudly that anybody was oppressing them, and told Congress to keep its hands off. The Eastern press could not process it. The whole national story about Utah required these women to be silent victims. And here were thousands of them, in public, on the record, articulate and furious, and not saying any of the lines they'd been assigned. 5 weeks later, the territorial legislature gave them the vote. Those two events are not unrelated. And now hold that up against the assumption most of us grew up with, the one where the Latter-day Saint women of that era were quiet women standing at the back of somebody else's history. 6,000 of them filled a building to tell the United States Congress it had misunderstood them, and 5 weeks later they were voting. Whatever those women were, background is not the word for it. Number 2, and she is in almost every story I've told you tonight. They called her the Presidentess, Eliza Roxy Snow. She's the woman with the pen and the cold open, and she is the through line of this entire episode. She was the church's most famous poet, and she wrote the hymn, "O My Father," which teaches a doctrine of a mother in heaven that Latter-day Saints still sing on Sundays. She was a plural wife of Joseph Smith and, after his death, of Brigham Young. And she was the second general president of the Relief Society from 1866 until her death in 1887. Here is what she actually did with those years. She traveled the settlements in the Mountain West over and over in wagons in her 60s and 70s, reorganizing relief societies town by town after they'd lapsed during the Exodus. She founded the Young Ladies Retrenchment Association in 1869, which is the ancestor of the church's Young Women's program today. She helped Aurelia Spencer Rogers start the first primary in Farmington, Utah in 1878, which is the ancestor of the children's organization every Latter-day Saint child on earth now attends. 3 organizations that between them touch nearly every member of this church every single Sunday, and one woman is standing behind all 3. And when she went out to those settlements to rebuild the societies, she did not do it from memory. She carried a book with her, the Nauvoo Minute Book, the one she'd written in that upper room in 1842, went west in her luggage, across 1,000 miles of prairie, and she read from it to rooms full of women who had never been to Nauvoo, and told them, This is what we were. This is what was said to us. This is the pattern. That book is why we know any of tonight's story at all. She saved it herself on purpose, because she understood exactly what would happen if she didn't. Which brings me to number 1. Jane Manning James, who walked 800 miles to join this church. And I want you to know before I start that I've been thinking about how to tell this one for a long time. Her name was Jane Elizabeth Manning James, and she was born free around 1822 in Wilton, Connecticut. She was baptized into this church in her late teens, and in 1843 she gathered 8 members of her family and set out for Nauvoo. And they got as far as Buffalo, and there they were refused passage on the boat because they were black. So they walked, something like 800 miles of it on foot through the fall, and by her own account, dictated many years later, their shoes wore out and gave up entirely, and they walked until the skin cracked open and their feet left blood on the ground. And they stopped and prayed, and she said their feet were healed. She got to Nauvoo. She lived in Joseph and Emma Smith's home and worked there, and she said later that Emma once asked her if she wanted to be sealed to the family as a child, and that she didn't understand what was being offered and said no, and that she regretted it for the rest of her life. She crossed the plains. She settled in Salt Lake City, and I want you to have the ordinary shape of her life there rather than just the sad part, because she was not a symbol, she was a neighbor. She buried a husband and children. She kept a farm and sold produce. She was a member of her ward relief society. She was known around town as Aunt Jane, and she turned up at the pioneer reunions, and people who wrote about those gatherings mention her by name. She paid her tithing for 60 years, and she donated money to the fund to build the Salt Lake Temple. Sit with that one for a second. She helped pay for a building she was not permitted to walk into. We know all of this in her own words because in 1893 she dictated her life story to a woman named Elizabeth Roundy. Dictated because Jane could not write. That document exists, and a scholar named Quincy Newell published a full biography of her with Oxford University Press in 2019, which is where a lot of the recent recovery of her story comes from. So there is now a real book about Jane Manning James, written by a historian from a university press. It took 111 years, and she wanted one thing. She wanted her temple ordinances, and she could not have them because of the restriction this church placed on black members, which kept them from the priesthood and from the temple for well over a century. So she petitioned. She wrote to church presidents by name again and again for something close to 40 years. She asked John Taylor. She asked Wilford Woodruff. She asked Joseph F. Smith. She kept asking. In 1894, the church allowed a ceremony for her, and I want to describe it exactly, because the exactness is the whole point. She was attached by proxy to Joseph Smith's family as a servant. She did not attend it in person because she could not enter the temple. A proxy stood in for her. She was granted in 1894 a permanent status as somebody's servant in eternity, when what she had asked for was the same thing every white woman in her ward received as a matter of course. She kept asking anyway. She died on the 16th of April, 1908, still asking, and her funeral was held in a Salt Lake tabernacle, and it was full, and the president of the church attended and spoke, because whatever the policy said, the people who actually knew her knew exactly who she was. The restriction was lifted in 1978, and in 1979, 71 years after she died, a group of Latter-day Saints went to the temple and performed Jane Manning James's endowment, the one she asked for in every letter she ever wrote. In the last several years, her story has been recovered properly, largely through a project at the University of Utah documenting the first century of Black Latter-day Saints. And there are members of this church today who know her name who would not have 5 years ago. That's number one. Not because she held an office, because she is what the quiet forgetting actually looks like when you follow it all the way down. Nobody burned her letters. They're in the archive. They were simply not read, and not taught, and not printed in a manual for the better part of a century. And a woman who walked 800 miles on bleeding feet to join this faith became a footnote in a story about somebody else. So let me answer the question you're probably holding, which is how any of this got lost in the first place. Not by a conspiracy, and I don't think anybody in this story woke up wanting to take anything from anyone. It went in pieces over about 60 years, and most of the pieces had a defensible reason attached. The independent funds were consolidated because a global church running on hundreds of separate local treasuries is an accounting nightmare and, frankly, a fraud risk. Ordinances got standardized because consistency across 100 countries is worth something real. The programs were correlated in the 1960s and 70s to put the same curriculum in front of every member on Earth, which was, on its own terms, a genuine achievement. The Relief Society magazine stopped publishing in 1970 after 55 years. And there was a sensible institutional reason for that, too. Add up 60 years of individually sensible decisions, and you get an outcome nobody chose. And then the second thing happens, and it's the one that does the actual damage. The history stops being told. Not suppressed, just not told. Because it doesn't fit the current arrangement neatly, and because a manual has limited pages, and because the person writing the lesson never heard it either. 2 generations of that, and a young woman concludes that the women in her church's past were mostly in the background, which is not what any single decision-maker intended, and is exactly what happened. And here's the part I'm genuinely glad to report, because this channel is not in the grievance business. It's coming back. In 2016, the Church Historians Press published a volume called The First 50 Years of Relief Society, which put the Nauvoo Minute Book and hundreds of other documents in print, in full, footnoted. And then the church put it online for free. Eliza Snow's handwriting, the blessing accounts, the arguments, the whole thing. The one that was in a vault for 174 years is now something you can read tonight on your phone without asking anybody's permission, which is why I opened on a book instead of a person. Everything I told you tonight survives because a woman in 1842 picked up a pen and then carried that book across the plains in a wagon and read out of it to rooms of women who had lost track of what they used to be. Eliza Snow understood something most of us don't, that a thing doesn't have to be destroyed to be lost. It just has to stop being said out loud. So say it out loud. That's the whole assignment, and it's the only one I've got for you. And here's where you come in, because this is not finished. There is a woman in your own family's history, or in your wards, who did something that isn't written down anywhere. The great-grandmother who held a branch together while the men were gone. The sister who ran the whole thing for 20 years and got thanked once. Somebody in this church knows her name, and the number of people who know it is going down every year. So put her in the comments, her name, and one true thing she did. That's it. I'll read every single one of them, and by tomorrow there will be a list on this video of women who were about to be forgotten and now won't be, which is a strange and slightly wonderful thing for a comment section to be. And if you want the natural next episode from here, it's the one I'm building on Emma Smith, who has been used as a footnote by both sides of this history for 150 years and deserves a great deal better. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.